All right. So if you didn't already know, our final exam is going to be on Thursday at 10:15, and it's here in this classroom. You'll have 2 hours to take the exam, and you're welcome to show up early, but you'll actually be logging in with a different account, not your usual account. I have a series of guest accounts that have been created that I'll hand out to you, and the purpose for that is that it inactivates any access to your V drive. So, I mean, I'll be standing at the classroom, the back of the classroom to try and keep an eye on things, but during the exam, you're not permitted to access any pre-existing Excel files or MATLAB files. You have to do everything from scratch, and so that's why you'll be using those guest accounts. And so you're welcome and encouraged to show up early if you want to kind of get settled in before the test starts, but there's no sense in logging in beforehand because you're going to have to use those guest accounts once you get on to the second part of the exam. So let's talk a little bit about the exam format since we're on the subject. One thing I think you'll be pleased to learn is that you're allowed to use a formula sheet on both parts of the exam. There are two sections on the exam. A part 1, which is more conceptual in format, and part 2, which is more problem solving and programming oriented in format. And so you're allowed to use this formula sheet on both. It has to be an 8.5 by 11 size paper or smaller if you want to go smaller, but it can't be a poster board. You can write on both sides of the page, but it can only be a single sheet of paper, and you will need to write your name on it, and I'm going to collect those at the end of the exam. Yes? Yes, you're welcome to type. You can make it as small as you want. You can have anything on there that will help you on the test. You know, encouraging notes from your grandma, menu for what's for dinner, you know, whatever is going to help you be in the right mind space, or I'll give you some suggestions on what maybe should be included on that in a minute. But yes, typing is fine. All right, so like I mentioned already, part 1 is more of a conceptual portion of the exam, and even though the exam is mostly covering Excel and MATLAB, you will be allowed on part 1 to use your calculator. There may be questions where, for instance, you remember on the first exam I asked you to simulate on paper what you would do in Excel. You know, like if you copied and pasted a formula, how would the relative referencing react to moving it 2 cells down and 1 cell to the right? And then you had to do some simple calculations to show that you understood the relative referencing. So on part 1, you can use your calculator if it would be useful in solving those conceptual type problems. There's 40 points out of 100 for part 1 of the exam, and of our 2-hour time limit, I'm going to cut people off at 45 minutes. It seemed like during the first exam, some people got themselves into trouble by spending too much time on the first part of the test, even though the second part of the test was worth more points. And so to kind of encourage people along at a steady pace, 45 minutes will be the cutoff for part 1. And it's going to include a wide range of topics. You know, it seems like a long time ago that we were working with Excel, but a good portion of what we did with Excel was after the first midterm. As far as conceptual questions, you may be asked to define certain functions and how they operate. You would be given a flow chart and asked to interpret and apply a flow chart. You know, we discussed that briefly when we were talking about programming structure. Another type of thing along the lines of programming structure is pseudocode, similar to flowcharts except for line by line. There are certain limitations on the way that file names are generated in MATLAB, and so how to apply functions and so on. I'll show you a couple of example questions in a moment. The second part of the exam is related to problem solving, both Excel and MATLAB. So it's 60% of the test, and so you can use more than 45 minutes. You can use all the remaining time. So At a minimum, you'll have an hour and 15 minutes to work on part 2, but if you get part 1 done even faster, then you can use all the remaining time during the 2-hour period for part 2 of the test. Any questions so far? Yeah.
If you cut us off on part 1 and then finish part 2 early, can we go back to part 1?
No. Because, you know, if there's a question you didn't know, then you could maybe look it up in the help section of MATLAB. And so the only thing you're going to be able to use on part 1 will be your brain and that formula sheet. So you won't be able to come back to it. It'll be like your one chance to answer. Yes?
Will it be mostly multiple choice? Or
No. There may not be any multiple choice on it. So it's mostly going to be short answer, calculation. Yeah. Yes?
There's a lot of like Casio questions, just like
No. No, there won't be questions that are specifically about how the Casio operates. There won't. Yes?
So the exam's more towards what we learned after the midterm on.
That's right.
So it's not cumulative.
Well,
A little bit of
you know, I want to be cautious in the way I put this because it's naturally cumulative. You know, like you have to know some of the basics about Excel to do the more advanced stuff that came after the first part of the exam. But I'm not going to be intentionally asking you questions that are just specifically and exclusively about that earlier material. It's my intention to test you on the things since the second midterm. I think you understand my point. Yeah. Other questions? Yes? Linear interpolation. Well, I don't want to tell you if individual subjects will be on there or not on there. But if I remember correctly, that was one of the subjects that was included on the first exam, right? So there may be some component of linear interpolation embedded in a larger problem that's beyond the things we did in the first exam, but I'm not going to specifically ask you a question that's only about one of those topics from the first part of the course. All right. So here's a list of some of those Excel topics that we've done since exam 1. So you have to know the Excel basics to be able to do these more sophisticated things. And so there are some built-in math and trigonometry functions. And so, for instance, one of the things that trips up students continually, even with the juniors and seniors that I work with, is if you're using the trigonometry functions in Excel, it's expecting inside of the parentheses the number to be in terms of radians. And so that's something that you'd need to remember for the exam is like what are the ways that those functions are used and what are the expectations that Excel has when you use them. So if there's a question on part 1 about those how Excel handles the built-in functions, it would be something that you either have to know by memory or is written down on your equation sheet. But during the second part of the exam, I'm more than happy to have you using help files. That's not cheating at all. If you want to use MATLAB's built-in help functionality or even Excel's built-in help functionality. So you can't go to like websites to search for information during the exam, but any component of the program that's automatically built in to either Excel or MATLAB, then that would be fine. So these are some of the things that we did. You'll remember, for instance, the VLOOKUP was a function that could be very useful in assigning grades because what it'll do is you'll have a table of a grading scale and then a list of students and so it would go and look up information off of a table and assign a characteristic like a letter grade based on a number range. And so it's, you know, most of these first three are pretty simple, but the VLOOKUP is a little more complicated and it's fairly important. So I'd encourage you to especially refamiliarize yourself with the VLOOKUP function and also the if function. Because the if function allows you to set up conditional calculations that are only calculated if a certain threshold is met or if there's a relational operator, greater than, less than, equal to, those sorts of things. A lot of the graphing that we did was in part 1. of the course. You've already been tested on creating, like scatter plots. But there were some new kinds of graphs that we did in Excel, like we looked at bar charts in comparison to pie charts and which one is better. And also, the histogram analysis is pretty important. And so you may want to go back through some of the examples where we identified how to set up the bins. And there is a wizard that steps you through the histogram process, but it's better to be well prepared on the exam day, even if you have a vague remembering of how it went in the past. I consider a lot of this other stuff fairly simple, like how to align cells, centering, changing fonts, the number type, and so on. But this has been in the past, and so I'll remind you that all of the lectures we've had this semester are recorded and available on MU Online. In fact, if we just go to class lecture videos, then what you can do is see all of the lectures we've had since the first test. And so the first exam was class 14. And so what you'll see is links to class 15 through 27. Now 28 and 29 there weren't recordings, but there will be a recording today, and I'll post that link there as well. Do you have a question?
Actually, the problem is, there's a few of them that I try to pull up
Mm-hmm.
that says no video.
Mm-hmm.
I had to go in to your actual profile.
Okay. Yeah, if that's the case, will you please send me an email so I can change it? I mean, some of these there is no lecture video, but if there was a specific one where the link isn't working, then... Okay. Well, if you'll email me a reminder, then I'll definitely go in there and fix that. All right, so, but like he mentioned, if you go to one of these, then you can search within my YouTube channel and find whatever you need.
I was looking at some of the MATLAB videos, the link would pop up asking to like log into a Google account or something.
Mm-hmm.
So I just
Okay.
some of those.
If you do have a specific issue that you notice, send me an email because I'd like to try and look into it. Yeah. When I'm logged in as the account owner, the way the links react for me may be different than the way they react for you. So if you can tell me where you're having a problem, then that'll give me a starting point for trying to fix it. So that's one suggestion I have is for some of this older stuff, like the Excel topics, maybe you could go through the videos or at least sections of the video. And sometimes the videos are a little slow moving, and you can even watch YouTube videos at double speed if you want to do that. They're in the tools. If you click on the little gear icon, you can speed up and slow down videos so that you can get through them more quickly. Now, MATLAB topics that are included in Exam 2. This is more recent, but hopefully going through this list just briefly will trigger a few memories in your mind of examples we worked in class and things that you had to do in the homework assignments. So there are some limitations on the way that variables are named. Certain things, certain pre-existing functions that can't be assigned to variable names, and rules on, for example, starting with numbers aren't allowed, and different characters that are prohibited. Now, the order of operations is, knowing where to put parentheses. In class last time on Tuesday, there were several cases where people's programs were set up beautifully, like they'd done a really nice job programming, but the graph was wrong, and they knew it was wrong because they saw what it should look like, and their graph isn't looking the right way, and it was all just because a set of parentheses was missing. Maybe it was a set of parentheses around some fraction that all of the fractions should be in the exponent. And so order of operations is never going to go away. That's going to be an important, even though it was something we initially talked about in the first part of the course when we were doing spreadsheet stuff with Excel, being able to correctly translate a formula from a graphical format into a linear format that MATLAB can read. You have to be comfortable and able to remember the order of operations. So exponents before dividing, Addition, subtraction is last, that sort of thing. All right. Now, the heart of the exam is going to be your ability to generate scripts and do programming. And remember that the cornerstone of a good program is one that's easy to understand and that executes efficiently. And I would encourage you in the exam to use commenting. And here's why. I want to give you partial credit as much as I can. I want every student to succeed, but you have to meet me halfway. If your script doesn't work perfectly, then I'm not going to spend all afternoon trying to figure out what your thinking was. I'm going to do my best to figure out, what you knew and what you didn't know. But if you include comments and you say, for instance, this line, I'm using the linspace function to create a matrix over such a range with so many values, those commenting functions can be a way for you to kind of signpost what you already know. And so you're likely to get more partial credit if your script doesn't run if you do have comments. Now, if you're 100% sure your script's going to run great and you're not going to make any mistakes, then by all means, don't bother with comments. But otherwise, I think it's really to your benefit if you do include them. All right. A lot of the things in this list, as we go through the MATLAB topics, you may remember functions that we used. And in the equation sheet, I think it would be a really great idea for you to write down the list of functions, kind of like your toolkit for programming. A list of what things you've used and a little bit about how they operate. The arrays that we created, sometimes we just typed them in at the command line. We can also do it through importing data, but you should be prepared to do either. And remember that we solved polynomials. We evaluated polynomials for certain x values. The polyval function, you define at what value you want to evaluate the function, or you can have systems of equations where you've got an x, y, and z variable that you're trying to solve for. You should remember the commands associated with creating plots, how to turn the grid lines on, how to change colors if necessary, how to change symbol sizes. And sometimes you can do that in the plot once it's created, but you also should be prepared to specify things in a script, like turning grid lines on and off, for instance. Now, in MATLAB, sometimes we have to use the dot operator if we want to do calculations on an element-by-element basis rather than for the entire matrix all at once. And so especially review the examples where you would do the dot operator, dot exponent, dot divide, and so on. And then some of these other things are more recent, where we were multiplying matrices together, solving equations, using for loops, and so on. So let me show you a couple of examples of questions that you might face on the exam, and then we can see if there are any questions related to that. So part one, like was asked before, is it going to be multiple choice and so on? I don't think there is likely to be any multiple choice questions. I think that what you're going to need to be able to do is explain how functions work. And so maybe as a short answer question, you could be given a certain command and need to explain what it does, clear. So explain, what does the clear function do? Anybody want to take a crack at that? What does clear do? Go ahead. All right. Right. So, if you've previously defined variables, it's going to clear them so they're not defined anymore. It's something that we've used a lot at the beginning of programs to make sure that we're starting from scratch. All right. So the linspace command, explain what that does in MATLAB and include a description of the required syntax. And this is something that on the homework assignment people were having some trouble with, because in linspace you had to go, if I remember correctly, it was from 1 to 200, and there should be 500 elements there. And so sometimes just remembering the order that the commands are supposed to go in is the critical thing. So in the case of linspace, it's the beginning, end, and then the number of increments in between. So these are examples of the types of questions you could expect to see on the part 1, which is more conceptually oriented. Or tell me a MATLAB variable name that would not be valid. According to the rules of characters you're not allowed to use. You can't start with numbers. Special characters like percent symbol can't be used. You can use underscore but not hyphen, and so on. So those are some of the conceptual questions. Here's another one. Being able to interpret and apply flowcharts. And this is along the idea of creating and translating pseudocode into program. So we looked at a flowchart in one of the earlier lectures, and so on the exam you might be given a figure like this, and then the question would be for certain variable definitions, like if y begins at a certain value, how many times would it cycle? Or what's the end result of the calculation if you have a k range that goes up to a certain number of repeats if there's a for loop, and so on. So just being able to apply the logic of a flowchart and seeing what's the number that comes out of a flowchart is something you can expect to see on the test. And there's going to be some synthesis as well. It's not just about interpreting and being able to just kind of like regurgitate definitions, but in this case, this is a function that's used in hydraulic engineering to predict what the depth of flow in a channel would be. If you have a rectangular channel and you know how steep the channel is, like what is its slope, and the roughness of the material, whether it's made out of concrete or plastic, then that n value describes the roughness, and q is related to the flow rate. So if you knew these things, then we wanted to have you create a script that calculated the depth over a range of slope values. So you'd need to write a script where inside of the script you're defining the variables that are given directly in the script, where you'd need to create the function and have it calculate, and then setting up the plot options. So compared to what you've been doing recently, this might actually be kind of simple, because to do this, I guess there would be a loop, because you'd be calculating it over a range of values, but there wouldn't necessarily be conditional, like some of the structural calculations you did where it was one equation up to a certain point and then another equation beyond that point. But this is just an illustration of calculating and plotting some data. Okay, so I get this question a lot. How should I study for the test? And it's sometimes difficult for me to answer that because everyone learns differently. Some people prefer to learn by hearing things. Some people are more visual learners and like to see graphs and diagrams to help learn. Other people are really kinesthetic, which means you learn with your hands. Like creating models is the way that you prefer to learn. So, how to study partly depends on what your preferred learning style is, but then it also depends on what's your objective. And some people just want to pass, or maybe you've got an 85 right now, and nothing you can do really would bring that up to a 90, and nothing you're likely to do would bring that down into the C range. And so maybe you just want to come in and just kind of get it over with, So it depends on your study strategies, partly depends on what your goals are. But my suggestion is, at a very minimum, you should review the examples that were worked in class. If we took the time to go through it together, where I was doing it on the screen and you were doing it on the computer, then there's some information there that you need to refamiliarize yourself with, just to reacquaint the basic principles of what you did. But that's the minimum. If you really want to achieve more than just typical results, what I'd suggest is to rework the example from scratch. Not just look at what you already have in your notes and not just open up the M file that you saved that day, but go back to the lecture recording and see what was the prompt. What were we trying to achieve in that example? And then on your own, without all the step-by-step that I gave you in that example, try to do it on your own, because that's the conditions that you're going to face during the test. During the test, you can't use the YouTube video, you can't use any of your existing files unless you happen to print it out on the page. If you want to print out an M file on your one sheet of paper, then you can have typed information. But I think that I'm going to compare and contrast the minimum study strategy with what would be better. So the next minimum would be to just look at the homework that you've done till now. Because remember, you have to put something on that formula sheet that you're allowed to use. And so going through your existing homework solutions will allow you to make a list of the functions that you've used so far. But better than just looking at what you submitted before, it would be better if you reworked them from scratch. And hopefully, it wouldn't take as much time the second go around. And I'm sure everyone could solve the homework that you just submitted recently a lot faster. Now that you've done it once, you hopefully remember what the commands are. And so doing it over again will really solidify the concepts in your memory. So at a minimum, you don't want to come in here empty-handed without any kind of equation sheet. And so what I'd suggest you be sure to include on that equation sheet is a list of every function that was used. Just, what is the command? Linspace, plot, grid, some of the key commands. But even better than that is list the command and then also what is the syntax requirement. What is supposed to be between the commas or between the colons? Is it supposed to have brackets and parentheses or just brackets? Should you suppress after a command or not suppress? And so it's fine if for the most complicated things that you always seem to have trouble remembering maybe how to do an if-else statement. Then it's fine to include an example of an if-else you had that worked so that you can, written down on the paper, so that you can use that on the exam itself. But there's probably plenty of the functions that just seeing the function and the syntax reminder will be enough, and you don't need to see it in the form of an example. So any questions or comments about these study strategies? All right, so just a final reminder about the class videos. And please, if you do come across one of the links that isn't working, email me specifically which one it is and I'll fix it. Romello? Yes, I'm going to post a video of today's class. That's all the information I've got for you today. I'm going to stick around here in the classroom if there are specific questions that I can address for you. But remember that what you should do is be on time. You don't want to shortchange yourself. It's a week from today. We'll be right in the middle of it, a week from today. Right? Because right now it's 11:34. You'll be almost done. All right. Have a good one, and I'll see you then.